Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 37 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Detroit Red Wings, in which the Sharks have managed to win 3-2 in overtime. Their sixth overtime win of the season, compared to a grand total of 0 overtime losses, though not technically 0 post-regulation losses, as when in games that have ended in the shootout, the Sharks are 1-1, a grand total of 7-1 in games that have gone past regulation. But when they end in that 5-minute 3-on-3 overtime period, the Sharks are perfect. This is also their second straight 3-2 overtime victory and their third straight 3-2 victory in general. So these games have been very close, but the Sharks have managed to come out on top in each of them and have actually looked like the solidly better team in each of them. These have not been just inched out, barely won games by the Sharks. They have looked rather solid in each of those 3 games they played. And here tonight, absolutely no different. Probably the game that has been most dominant for the Sharks over this 3-game winning streak. You could definitely argue maybe the game against the Flyers there as well, as the Sharks in the first period just kind of take it to the Detroit Red Wings, not necessarily getting a ton of offense generated, but certainly limiting what the Detroit Red Wings could do. A period similar to that of the Buffalo Sabres against the Buffalo Sabres a couple of games ago, and the Sharks would score the only goal of that first period coming from Timo Meyer as he stays hot here tonight. So it's 1-0 heading into the second period. In the second period, it's more of the same from the San Jose Sharks, continuing to keep the Red Wings at bay, at the very least at even strength. The Sharks getting some chances for themselves, though not able to convert on Nedeljkovic, who actually had a very solid game in net for the Red Wings. Then it came late in the second period where Mario Ferraro takes a pretty undisciplined penalty in the defensive zone, just hounding his man a bit too much. Sharks head to the box, and then the puck comes down the ice. Nedeljkovic is handling it pretty far out of his own net. Tomas Hertl does get a stick into the skates of Nedeljkovic, who then just absolutely flops down like a soccer player you would see, and the Sharks end up having to kill off about 100 seconds of 5-on-3 time, and they do almost an extremely good job of it. Erik Karlsson made some very nice shorthanded plays there. Logan Couture, as usual, has always been that guy for the 5-on-3 penalty kill, and he was doing a fantastic job. But eventually, with less than a second remaining on the 5-on-3, the Red Wings would get a goal. That would be Bertuzzi to tie up the game at 1. And while there wouldn't be another goal coming from the power play, the last 20 seconds of the power play after this one, and in the last 20 seconds of the second period, the game would be tied in one that the Sharks were probably hoping to lead after 2 periods. And then come early in the third, they actually found themselves falling behind here as Nick Leddy would score his first of the season, his first as a Detroit Red Wing, to take the lead for Detroit 2-1. Luckily for the Sharks, it would actually be the unlikeliest of heroes, Jeff Viel, who would get his second of the season to tie it up at 2, and we'd eventually end up going to an overtime where we would get our trio of surprisingly Meyer, Hertl, and Karlsson. I thought we would see Meyer, Hertl, and Burns like we saw in the previous game against the Flyers, but Karlsson gets back his spot on that top overtime unit. That one gets doesn't necessarily do a ton, but when we see the transition to Couture, Dahlen, and Burns, they manage to work it flawlessly into the offensive zone. They avoid the octopus that was thrown onto the ice by a Detroit Red Wings fan, and eventually Logan Couture manages to sweep it in on the goal line into the net, and the Sharks, like I said, win it 3-2. So moving on to the players to talk about here tonight, we have the first line of Barabanov, Hertl, and Meyer, and once again, this was just a fantastic line for the San Jose Sharks. Hertl and Meyer absolutely once again leading the way for the San Jose Sharks. Hertl looking like a completely different player here from how he looked earlier on in the season. I mentioned that in the previous game against the Flyers, and it is the same here tonight, just dominating games like we haven't really seen consistently from Tomas Hertl since the 18-19 season, honestly. And so while he doesn't actually get another goal here tonight like he had been doing in previous games, he was still a very dominant force for the San Jose Sharks. The same goes for Timo Meyer. He does in fact get on the scoreboard, and he probably could have had more goals than that. There was this one particular shift, I believe, in the third period where he hits the post. Then Nedeljkovic makes a very good save on him. Then he hits the post a second time, all within the span of about 3 or 4 seconds. So 3 high danger, fantastic grade A opportunities for Timo Meyer to score. He gets robbed on one of them, and then he gets robbed by the post, and I guess you could say unlucky on a couple of those other ones. And so Meyer ends up with just the one goal here tonight, but certainly deserving of more. These two players still absolutely fantastic for the Sharks. And like I mentioned in that Flyers game review, Barabanov kind of just along for the ride here, still looking pretty solid in his own right, though I certainly wouldn't put him as the driving force of this line. On the second line, we have the return of Logan Couture, who takes the spot of Scott Reedy in the lineup, and I can say that there was a noticeable improvement going from Scott Reedy to Logan Couture. Couture returning to the lineup after a brief sort of stop off onto the COVID protocol list, missed a couple of games. He's placed with his usual line mate of Jonathan Dahlen, but not with Timo Meyer. Still, his Hurdle ends up keeping that first line spot because of how good he has been, so he ends up with Noah Gregor on this second line. And Couture's game did not miss a beat here tonight, was absolutely fantastic. Also a very dominant force for the San Jose Sharks. Ends up getting rewarded for it with a goal near the end of the game in that overtime game winner, but he certainly could have had at least a couple earlier on. He also was just a driving force on this line that rose up the two other players, his two other line mates. Dahlen, he definitely looked better last game, but he hasn't necessarily been all that great over these past few games. But here tonight looked like also a very different player, definitely much more engaged, and he seemed to be going back to the things that were working very well for him earlier on this season. A big part of Dahlen's game that allowed him to get those goals racked up earlier on this year was the fact that he would just drive to the net and put himself in great position to score, and he kind of got away from that over this past month or even 2 months as he's been dealing with some injuries, some COVID protocol issues, and maybe bouncing around the lineup a bit, but he got back to it tonight. He ends up with 2 very nice assists in this game, one on the overtime winner, one a very nice one on the Timo Meyer power play goal, and so generally a very good game for Dahlen and a very good game for Couture. Gregor, as usual, Gregor had a lot of chances here tonight, probably a good 3 or 4 where he had a very golden opportunity to bury the puck in, but he continues to be a very snake-bitten player for the San Jose Sharks. Gregor, all the speed in the world, but just none of the skill to be able to finish it off and score some goals. If Gregor just had a bit more finishing powers, he'd probably be a 20, 25 goal scorer with the speed that he exhibits. Kind of reminds me of a player on the Montreal Canadiens, Paul Byron, a player who had actually gotten waived by the Calgary Flames because he was just all speed, no finish, continuously would get breakaways for the Flames, but not actually be able to score on any of them. But when he was picked up by the Montreal Canadiens, something just kind of clicked, and he ended up being a pretty solid player for them for a few years. Noah Gregor, hopefully something can click there, because if he manages to start to find the back of the net, the goals should end up rolling in. When it comes to the third line, Nieto, Weatherby, and Cogliano, you could say they're missing a bit Nick Bonino. I thought Cogliano actually got some very nice chances here tonight, and Nieto did show off some decent speed, but Weatherby certainly seems to be a downgrade from the usual Nick Bonino in this particular role. Weatherby definitely more so of a fourth line center, and even a borderline fourth line center at that, so hopefully we'll see Bonino return to the lineup at some point. On the fourth line, we have Nick Merkley, VL, and Adam Raska, who gets his first career NHL game. Raska had a very strong rookie camp as well as preseason for the San Jose Sharks. Really made it to the end of the line during that preseason, but was eventually just barely cut at the last possible moment and sent back down to the AHL. But he finally gets an opportunity. It wasn't that much of a surprise that he would be given an opportunity this season with how impressive he was prior to the year's start. And he actually didn't look too bad here tonight. I wouldn't say he was, dominating the ice when he was on. I wouldn't say that the fourth line was a driving line for the San Jose Sharks here tonight either, but he drew a penalty. He had a couple of nice forechecking plays, and so generally a pretty solid night for Raska, and it wouldn't surprise me for him to be able to stay in the lineup, especially with how good the Sharks as a whole looked. I would be surprised if there was even a line change at all, unless there is a return of a player like Nick Bonino. Then we might see someone get bumped out. When it comes to Nick Merkley centering the fourth line, I never really understood why Nick Merkley ended up getting moved out of the lineup. I always thought he was at the very least better than players like Gadjevich and Peterson, who seemed to semi-consistently get games. And so here tonight, Merkley had a couple of decent plays. Again, not super dominant, but still better than a lot of the other players the Sharks have iced on the fourth line this season. So we'll see if he manages to keep a spot. Honestly, if Bonino does return to the lineup on Thursday. I kind of hope that Merkley keeps his fourth line center spot and it's Weatherby stepping out of the lineup. And finally, Jeff Viel gets his second goal of the season. His first goal was on a very lucky break as the puck deflects off of a opposing team stick in front and goes in. And here tonight, it's off of another lucky break. He ends up getting taken down by Sider. He slides into Nedeljkovic, and the puck just sort of rolls over the goal line, and it ends up being credited to Viel. I was surprised that goal didn't get challenged, but in the end, Viel, he works hard, I guess, and honestly as well, wouldn't be the worst to see him out of the lineup, but I guess after scoring a goal, it's going to be a bit hard to do so. On the defensive side of things, we had a bit of a change in terms of defensive pairing. So Burns and Ferraro, of course, remained a duo here tonight. Brent Burns continues to rack up the points, 6 assists over these past 2 games, 3 assists in each of them. He has assisted on every single goal that the Sharks have scored in these past 2 games. He's been very strong offensively, which has been nice to see. Very streaky player Brent Burns has been so far this season. Nice to see that he's on the up and up right now, and hopefully he can stay at this sort of on this hill for a while before he goes back down into the valley, if that does actually end up happening. He also was, I would say, improved somewhat defensively here tonight. The Sharks as a whole looked very strong defensively, and Brent Burns was definitely a big part of that. Obviously, if the Sharks are going to look bad defensively on a particular night, Brent Burns is going to be a big reason of that because he plays so many minutes. And so if the Sharks are going to look good defensively, Brent Burns is also going to be a big part of that, and he was tonight. On the second pairing, here's where we have the interesting situation. Karlsson does return to the lineup, and he ends up getting placed with Jacob Megna on the second pairing. As Merkley and Megna were separated, you might think that Karlsson and Vlasic would end up as a pairing because Merkley and Megna have kind of been attached at the hip for most of this season. That when they came up to the NHL, they played together. When they've been in the AHL, they've played together. But it seems as though Bob Booner is specifically avoiding the Karlsson-Vlasic duo. I remember when Karlsson first arrived to the San Jose Sharks back in 18-19, there was a lot of hype that Vlasic and Karlsson could end up making a defensive duo that would be one of the best, if not the best, in the league, but they never really found chemistry. In fact, Vlasic looked considerably worse, and so did Karlsson when those two players were playing with each other, so they seem to have some sort of clash chemistry-wise, so it's good to just not play them together. Basically, oil and water those two players are, so in the end, Megna and Merkley are separated, and it works out very well here tonight. Karlsson was one of the Sharks' best players here. I thought Karlsson looked very, very strong. A solid defensive game. Made some nice offensive plays as well. And then the third right-handed defenseman here on the right side for the defenseman, we have Burns, Karlsson, and then Ryan Merkley placed with Marc-Edouard Vlasic. And Merkley just looked so poised here tonight. Very, very strong game for Ryan Merkley. He manages to maintain a spot in the lineup even with the return of Erik Karlsson. So that was definitely an interesting step moved forward by Bob Booner, and he was absolutely deserving of being kept in the lineup at this point. And I remember when Merkley was drafted back in the 2018 entry draft, and then the Sharks just a couple months later picked up Erik Karlsson. The ultimate dream for Sharks fans was that the Sharks would be able to run on the right side Burns, Karlsson, and Ryan Merkley. And while obviously Burns has declined since that dream, and Erik Karlsson isn't necessarily living up to where the Sharks fans really expected him to be after the acquisition from the Ottawa Senators, and Merkley took a bit of time to get here, in the end we do end up with that dream scenario for the Sharks. It's Burns, Karlsson, and Merkley down the right side, and they looked absolutely fantastic here. Merkley just looked amazing on this pairing with Marc-Edouard Vlasic, who seemed to also be somewhat rejuvenated playing with some young blood on this pairing. This was potentially the Sharks' best pairing. Obviously, they had a bit of the easier matchups. Merkley was not really given any penalty killing time compared to Burns and Karlsson, but if you had told me that this was a player who was, undisciplined and had defensive issues and things like this, I would have not believed you after watching this game, because he just looked so solid in all three zones, the neutral, the defensive, and the offensive zone, and he absolutely should be kept in the lineup once Middleton does return from his injury. I don't know if that's sooner or later. I do absolutely hope that it is going to be Middleton stepping in favor of Megna, and Merkley will have earned a pretty permanent spot here on this top 6 defense, and Shemek could end up being the 7th defenseman. And as we move on to Aiden Hill, he let in a couple of goals here tonight. The first one from Bertuzzi, he certainly didn't really have much of a chance on, but the one that he did have a chance on, and is rather disappointing for the Hill to end up letting in, is this Nick Leddy goal. Kind of reminds me of the game against the Flyers, in which the Sharks ended up winning 3-2. That was the first game against them. James Reimer was in nets for that one. He didn't have much of a chance on the first goal scored by the Flyers, but the goal scored by Joel Farabee that tied that game was from pretty far out, very similar to this goal scored by Nick Leddy. And I remember in that game, I said Reimer otherwise played solid, and so that bad goal that he did let in was more so forgivable. Here tonight, I'm not as lenient with Aiden Hill just because Hill has a much more frequent tendency of letting in these types of goals. I mean, I feel as though that this type of goal scored by Nick Liddy has been scored on Aiden Hill a good 5+ times this season, which is just inexcusable because these are really bad goals to be letting in, especially in this type of situation early in the third period. So it ended up being an okay game for Hill, I guess, but this Leddy goal is just something that cannot go in. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action on Thursday. They will take on the New York Rangers for the second and final time this season. The first matchup with the Rangers did not go the Sharks' way, though at the very least they didn't get absolutely destroyed. They ended up losing it by a score of 1-0. So the Sharks will look to actually get a goal against the New York Rangers and try to keep the winning streak rolling. Class dismissed.